By the summer of 1944, Warsaw was a city worn down by years of occupation, yet still tense with expectation. Nazi rule had stripped the city of its political life, its Jewish population, and much of its physical fabric. Executions, deportations, and collective punishment were not exceptional events. They were part of the city's rhythm. Fear was constant, but so was defiance, simmering beneath the surface of daily survival. The Nazi occupation imposed control, not only through violence, but through systematic humiliation. Public spaces were monitored, culture was suppressed, and Polish identity itself was treated as a threat. Schools were closed or reduced to basic instruction. Intellectual life was driven underground, and even casual gatherings risked punishment. Warsaw existed in a state of forced stillness, where normal life continued only in fragments. Yet Warsaw's suffering carried an additional layer that made its situation unique. To the east stood the advancing Soviet army, nominally an enemy of Nazi Germany, but not a liberator in Polish memory. Many Warsaw residents remembered the Soviet invasion of 1939, mass arrests, executions, and deportations. The approaching Red Army represented not freedom, but uncertainty. Liberation from one tyranny threatened replacement by another. This created a psychological trap. The Germans ruled the city with open brutality, while the Soviets loomed as an unspoken future threat. Warsaw was caught between two systems that denied Polish sovereignty in different ways. The city's resistance fighters understood that waiting passively could mean losing the chance to assert independence altogether. Time itself became an enemy. Daily life under this double pressure sharpened political awareness. Civilians followed rumours closely, tracked frontline movements, and listened secretly to radio broadcasts. Hope rose and fell with military news. The sense grew that history was moving fast, and that Warsaw might be left behind or crushed if it did not act on its own terms. The underground state that existed beneath Nazi control was not symbolic. It was functional. Secret schools, courts, newspapers, and military units operated in parallel to the occupation authorities. This hidden infrastructure kept alive the idea that Poland still existed, even if it had no visible government. Warsaw was not merely occupied. It was layered, with resistance woven into its structure. As German power weakened in 1944, repression intensified rather than eased. Forced labour increased, arrests multiplied, and entire districts were punished for suspected resistance activity. The occupiers understood that their grip was slipping and responded with greater violence. This escalation convinced many that survival without action was no longer possible. Thus, when the moment approached, Warsaw was not choosing between peace and war. It was choosing between silence and erasure. Living under Nazi terror while anticipating Soviet dominance created a sense of suffocation, political, moral, and historical. The city stood under two tyrannies at once, one present and crushing, the other approaching and ominous. The uprising would emerge from this pressure not as a reckless gamble, but as a final assertion of agency by a city determined to decide its own fate, even at unbearable cost. By late July 1944, Warsaw stood at a crossroads where inaction felt as dangerous as rebellion. The German occupation was visibly weakening. Retreating units passed through the city. Fortifications were hastily reorganized, and authority appeared strained. At the same time, the sound of artillery from the east carried a dangerous promise. The front was approaching. For the underground leadership, This moment felt both urgent and fragile, as if history had opened a narrow window that could close without warning. The Polish resistance faced a brutal calculation. Rising too early risked annihilation by still powerful German forces. Waiting too long risked something different, but equally final: the arrival of Soviet control without Polish participation in liberation. The uprising was not imagined as a purely military victory, but as a political act. It was meant to assert sovereignty in the only way left, by acting before others decided Poland's future in its place. Hope played a complex role in this decision. It was not blind optimism, but conditional expectation. Many believed the Germans were too weakened to suppress a full-scale revolt, and that the approaching Red Army would be forced to assist, or at least allow the city to stand. This hope was fragile, built on assumptions rather than guarantees, but it mattered. Without some belief in outcome, action would have been impossible. Desperation, however, weighed just as heavily. Years of occupation had eroded patience and left little faith in survival through endurance alone. Arrests continued, executions persisted, and entire neighborhoods lived under constant threat. For many fighters, waiting felt like slow suffocation. The uprising promised danger, but also clarity. It offered a chance to act rather than endure. Within the underground command, debate was intense and unresolved until the end. Intelligence was incomplete, communication uncertain, and external alliances unreliable. Decisions were made under pressure, with imperfect information and irreversible consequences. There was no moment of consensus that erased doubt. The choice to rise was taken with full awareness that it might fail. The civilian population was both a concern and a motivation. Warsaw was not a city of passive spectators. Its residents had supported the underground for years, hiding fighters, sharing information, and sustaining parallel institutions. Leaders understood that an uprising would draw civilians into the line of fire, yet also believed that continued occupation would do the same. Only, without resistance or dignity, time itself became decisive. As Soviet forces drew closer, hesitation threatened to render the resistance irrelevant. Acting meant risking everything. Not acting meant accepting a future shaped entirely by others. In this narrowing space between hope and despair, the decision took form not as confidence, but as resolve. When the order was finally given, it did not carry the promise of victory. It carried something more fragile and more human: the determination to be present in one's own history. The Warsaw Uprising was born not from certainty, but from the refusal to let fear and exhaustion have the final say. When the uprising began, the Home Army did not appear as a newly formed force. It revealed itself as something that had existed all along, hidden in plain sight. For years, the Polish underground state had operated beneath German occupation, maintaining military structures, civilian administration, courts, and education in secrecy. The moment the uprising started was not the creation of resistance, but its exposure. The Home Army was composed largely of civilians who had lived double lives. By day, they were workers, students, clerks, and neighbours. By night, they trained, planned, and prepared for a moment that had always been imagined but never fully defined. When orders were given, these ordinary identities were shed abruptly. The city itself became their uniform. Weapons were scarce and uneven. Many units entered the fight with limited firearms, homemade explosives, or nothing more than determination and knowledge of the streets. This imbalance shaped the character of the uprising. The Home Army did not rely on firepower superiority. It relied on coordination, surprise, and familiarity with the urban environment. Every courtyard, basement, and stairwell became tactically meaningful. Command and control under such conditions was fragile. Communication depended on runners, signals, and memory rather than radios. Units often fought in isolation, cut off from one another by German strongpoints or destroyed streets. Leadership was decentralized by necessity. Initiative mattered as much as obedience, and decisions were often made on the spot by young officers facing situations no training could fully anticipate. The emergence of the Home Army also altered civilian life instantly. The boundary between fighter and non-combatant blurred. Civilians provided shelter, intelligence, food, and medical aid, often at immense personal risk. The uprising was not confined to military units. It spread through households and neighborhoods, turning the city into a shared front. For the fighters themselves, stepping into the open carried psychological weight. Years of preparation had emphasized secrecy and survival. Now, visibility was unavoidable. Armbands replaced anonymity, and open confrontation replaced evasion. This shift demanded a different kind of courage. Not the patience of hiding, but the acceptance of being seen and targeted. The Home Army's appearance was also a declaration. By taking control of streets and districts, even temporarily, it asserted that Polish authority still existed. Flags were raised, orders issued, and symbols restored. These acts had limited military value but immense political meaning. They announced that Warsaw was not simply a battlefield between empires, but a city claiming agency. As the uprising unfolded, the Home Army's role became both military and symbolic. It fought not only against German forces but against erasure. Its presence on the streets was a reminder that occupation had not extinguished organization, discipline, or national identity. Stepping forward meant accepting overwhelming odds, but it also meant refusing invisibility. In revealing itself, the Polish underground transformed from a hidden structure into a visible force, briefly, precariously, and at enormous cost. The Home Army did not step forward expecting to dominate the battlefield. It stepped forward to prove that Warsaw was still capable of acting in its own name, even when the consequences were likely to be catastrophic. When the uprising erupted, one truth became immediately visible. Courage had arrived faster than weapons. Large numbers of young fighters reported to their units with little more than armbands, improvised grenades, or empty hands. Years of underground preparation had built organization and resolve, but it could not conjure rifles and ammunition out of thin air. Scarcity was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a defining condition. This imbalance shaped the age and character of the resistance. Many fighters were barely adults, students who had trained in theory more than practice. They understood streets better than battlefields. Some were assigned roles not because of skill, but because there were no alternatives. In many cases, the first objective was not to defeat the enemy, but to seize weapons from them. Equipment shortages forced constant adaptation. Captured firearms were redistributed immediately, sometimes still warm from use. Ammunition was counted obsessively. A single rifle might pass between several hands in one day, used where the need was most urgent. Planning revolved around what could realistically be sustained, not what doctrine recommended. This lack of equipment also created moral pressure. Commanders knew they were sending poorly armed youth into direct confrontation with experienced, heavily equipped German units. The decision to fight under these conditions was not driven by ignorance of risk, but by acceptance of it. The uprising advanced on conviction, not capacity. As the fighting spread, Warsaw transformed into a fragmented battlefield. Streets were no longer passages but front lines. Barricades rose from rubble, tram cars, furniture, and paving stones. Each intersection became a defensive point, each building a potential fortress. Control was measured not by districts, but by stairwells and courtyards. Urban combat collapsed distance. Engagements happened at close range, often face-to-face. Snipers, machine guns, and explosives turned narrow streets into kill zones. Movement required timing and familiarity. Fighters navigated through basements, attics, and breaches in walls, creating hidden routes that bypassed open ground. The city itself became a weapon. Barricades were both practical and symbolic. Militarily, they slowed armor and channeled enemy movement. Psychologically, they marked territory claimed by resistance. Each one declared presence. Yet they were also fragile. Artillery and air strikes reduced them quickly, forcing constant rebuilding under fire. Resistance became an act of repetition as much as confrontation. Civilians were inseparable from this form of warfare. They carried messages, supplied water, treated the wounded, and helped construct defences. At the same time, they were trapped within the battlefield. Homes became shelters, hospitals, and targets simultaneously. There was no safe rear area, only degrees of exposure. German response was systematic and overwhelming. Heavy weapons were brought to bear against lightly armed positions. Entire buildings were destroyed to eliminate resistance pockets. Fire was used deliberately to clear areas and punish support. Street fighting turned into attrition, with each gained block costing disproportionate lives. Despite this, resistance persisted longer than expected. Fighters adapted tactics constantly, learning through loss. The lack of weapons forced creativity, but also exacted a heavy toll. Successes were temporary, often followed by brutal retaliation. Victory was never stable. It had to be defended continuously. As days turned into weeks, the reality became inescapable. Courage could slow destruction, but not stop it. The streets bore the marks of relentless combat, burned facades, collapsed walls, makeshift graves. Yet even as the material balance worsened, the act of resistance itself continued to matter. The street fighting of Warsaw was not a contest of equals. It was a struggle defined by imbalance, endurance, and refusal. Poorly armed youth stood behind barricades not because they believed they would win militarily, but because surrender offered no future they could accept. Block by block, the city fought not for advantage, but for meaning. As the uprising continued, one expectation slowly turned into a burden heavier than enemy fire. The belief that help would arrive. Fighters listened for signs beyond the city. Aircraft engines, artillery shifts, any indication that external forces were moving. Each day without support stretched hope thinner, turning anticipation into quiet disbelief. The most painful absence was not abstract diplomacy, but physical proximity. Soviet forces stood on the opposite bank of the Vistula River, close enough to be imagined, close enough to be seen in the distance. For those fighting in Warsaw, this nearness made inaction unbearable. Help was not weeks away, it was across the water, and yet it did not come. Airdrops from Western allies were sporadic and limited. When they did occur, many supplies fell into German-controlled areas, unreachable or immediately lost. Ammunition, food, and medical materials, when most needed, arrived unpredictably, often too late to change outcomes. What was intended as support became a reminder of isolation. As days turned into weeks, the realization set in that Warsaw was fighting alone. Strategic explanations mattered little at street level. Fighters did not experience geopolitics. They experienced empty hands and wounded bodies. The absence of aid was not just military, it was psychological. It eroded belief in coordination, in promises, in the idea that sacrifice would be matched by action. This abandonment reshaped the meaning of the uprising. What began as a calculated assertion of sovereignty increasingly felt like a stand taken in full awareness of its isolation. The decision to continue was no longer sustained by expectation of victory, but by refusal to surrender while strength remained. Civilians were never spectators in the Warsaw Uprising. From the first day, they became participants by necessity. They carried messages through rubble, sheltered fighters, shared food they did not have, and transformed cellars into hospitals. Their courage did not take the form of weapons, but of exposure. Women and children often bore the invisible weight of resistance. They cooked under bombardment, tended to the wounded, and maintained fragile routines amid chaos. Water became as valuable as ammunition. Fetching it meant crossing open ground under fire. Each task carried risk, repeated daily. The cost was immediate and collective. German forces responded to resistance by targeting civilian areas deliberately. Mass executions, burning of buildings, and systematic destruction were used to break support networks. Courage was punished indiscriminately. Survival depended not on innocence, but on chance. Despite this, civilian involvement did not collapse. Neighborhoods organized collectively, sharing information and resources. Improvised hospitals treated both fighters and non-combatants. Even as conditions worsened, people continued to act as if community still mattered. This persistence became a form of resistance in itself. For many civilians, the choice was never between safety and danger. Both had disappeared. Helping the resistance did not increase risk so much as define how risk would be lived, with purpose or without it. Courage was found not in dramatic acts, but in repetition under threat. As the uprising faltered, civilians paid the heaviest price. Displacement, starvation, and death followed suppression. Entire districts were emptied or destroyed. The population that had sustained the fight was now subjected to collective punishment on a massive scale. Yet the role of civilians endures in the memory of the uprising. Their actions revealed that resistance was not confined to fighters with weapons. It lived in kitchens, basements, and shared decisions to help despite certainty of reprisal. The courage of Warsaw was not only armed, it was communal. In the end, the absence of outside help and the presence of civilian sacrifice defined the uprising's tragic character. Warsaw did not fall because it lacked bravery. It fell because bravery alone could not compensate for isolation. What remains is the record of a city that waited, endured, and acted together, long after hope should have expired. When German command realized that the uprising would not collapse quickly, repression turned into annihilation. What followed was not collateral damage, but policy. Entire districts were methodically destroyed, not for tactical necessity alone, but to punish defiance and remove Warsaw from the future altogether. Buildings were burned, blown apart, or flattened one by one. Streets that had carried resistance became targets, simply for having existed. This destruction was organized and deliberate. Specialized units moved through captured areas with orders not just to clear fighters, but to empty and demolish. Civilians were expelled or executed, then the cityscape itself was erased. Libraries, churches, hospitals, and homes were treated no differently than barricades. Culture and shelter were both declared enemies. Fire became a primary weapon. Large sections of the city burned uncontrollably, smoke hanging over Warsaw for days. Water supplies were cut, making firefighting impossible. The goal was not speed, but completeness. The city was being dismantled as a warning to Poles and to any population that might consider resistance elsewhere. The uprising lasted 63 days, not because conditions were sustainable, but because surrender was postponed as long as humanly possible. Each day reduced the fighters' options. Ammunition dwindled, food disappeared, and medical supplies were exhausted. Wounds that would have been survivable earlier became fatal. Exhaustion replaced momentum. Communication between resistance units fractured as districts fell. What had begun as coordinate action dissolved into isolated pockets of endurance. Fighters continued not because victory was visible, but because retreat had lost meaning. Holding a single building, a single cellar, or even a single hour became an act of will rather than strategy. Civilians endured alongside the fighters, often in worse conditions. Starvation spread. Disease followed. Families lived underground for weeks, merging only when forced. The line between combatant and non-combatant disappeared completely. Everyone left in Warsaw was, by German definition, part of the rebellion. As the weeks passed, the soundscape of the city changed. Gunfire gave way to explosions, then to silence punctuated by demolition. The uprising was not defeated in a final battle, but worn down through attrition. When resistance finally ceased, it did so not from sudden collapse, but from total depletion. Militarily, the Warsaw Uprising ended in defeat. The city was destroyed, the home army crushed, and the civilian population decimated or expelled. By any conventional measure, the operation failed. Yet almost immediately, its meaning began to shift. The question ceased to be whether the uprising succeeded and became why it mattered. In Polish memory, the uprising transformed into a moral event rather than a strategic one. It came to represent the refusal to accept imposed futures, even when resistance carried catastrophic cost. The scale of destruction did not erase the act, it amplified it. Warsaw became a symbol of what happens when defiance is answered with annihilation. This transformation did not deny the tragedy. On the contrary, suffering became central to remembrance. The uprising was not romanticized as victorious, but remembered as necessary. It expressed a belief that survival without agency was a different kind of defeat. In that sense, the loss of the city did not negate the act of resistance. It defined its weight. Over time, the legend of the uprising shaped Polish identity under later political systems that also restricted sovereignty. Remembering Warsaw became a way of asserting continuity, proof that resistance had existed even when erased from power. The destroyed city became a moral reference point rather than a physical one. The ruins were eventually rebuilt, but the meaning of the 63 days remained anchored in absence. Lives lost, streets erased, futures cut short. What endured was not the battlefield, but the memory of choice. Warsaw had risen knowing the odds. That knowledge became the core of its legacy. In the end, the Warsaw Uprising stands as one of history's most painful paradoxes. A city was destroyed so completely that defeat seemed absolute. Yet from that destruction emerged a legend stronger than victory, a reminder that resistance can fail militarily and still shape a nation's understanding of dignity, loss, and responsibility.